New York City, and we're here to talk about the crisis of capitalism. Richard's just wrapped up about an hour-and-a-half marathon talk about the crisis of capitalism at the Occupy Marin meeting just over the last few hours. And we're here to talk about the crisis. What are the causes of the crisis of capitalism? Why do we see now an emergence of the Arab Spring and the Occupy movements around the world, the explosions in Europe? And where are we going to go once we understand what's caused these crises? So I want to start off asking you a question, Richard. One of the things that you've done is provided analysis of the erosion of the standard of living of Americans over the last 40 years. Starting in the 1970s, in many of your speeches that I've heard in your writings, you talk about how a restructuring of American capitalism has resulted in a shifting of the wealth out of wages and benefits and into growing indebtedness. And I'm wondering if you could talk about why this explosion of borrowing really took off, what caused it, who was doing the lending, and why do we borrow so much? And what does this have to do with the crisis that we face today?
Well, you know, the best way I know to get into this is to talk a moment about the history of the United States. We are a remarkable country in that for most of our history, up until the 1970s, we were a society that raised the wages of its workers on a regular basis, decade after decade. Across the 19th century and most of the 20th century, that was true. It brought the waves of immigrants that make up the American people. It brought us a nation that assumed that if you work hard, you do well and you do better as time goes along and your children will do better than you and all that. And there was a reason for it. And that's what's kind of missing in most of our history books. The reason is what economists call a labor shortage. There were never enough people in the United States, partly because of what was done to the native people who were here when the Europeans came. But there was always a shortage. Capitalism was successful, businesses thrived, but they were always running up against the problem of not enough workers. And you can't run a capitalist business without workers. So the solution found by capitalists, always under these conditions, is to raise wages. It would induce people to come to the United States, particularly from Europe over most of this history. Although American capitalists discovered that no sooner did a worker come here from Italy or Poland or Ireland, but they would then say, if I don't get a rising wage, I'm going to go take land in the West, because the West was cleared. And so you had to pay workers not only to come here, but to stay on the East Coast or to stay where the industries were. And so you had this rising wage. In the 1970s, not to make it too complicated, the labor shortage ended. And there were simple reasons for this. Number one, the computer revolution. We replaced millions of workers with machines. Instead of having 50 people keeping track of the inventory in a supermarket, you have one guy sitting in an office somewhere in Boise, Idaho, watching a ticker telling you how many rolls of toilet paper or boxes of cereal had been sold, and you knew when to replenish. Number two, American corporations, because the wages had risen for 150 years, began to see that they could make much more profits by hiring workers in places in the world where the wages hadn't risen for 150 years. So they began leaving the United States in bigger and bigger waves. So suddenly, between the computer getting rid of jobs and the departure for other parts of the world of American corporations, the demand for workers fell apart. Meanwhile, for all kinds of reasons, American women, partly the women's liberation movement, things like that, starting in the 70s, began moving in to look for paid work. And we had a new wave of immigrants, this time from Latin America. So you put that together, computer and export of jobs, meaning there's less demand, and women and immigrants coming in, more supply, corporations everywhere in America discovered don't need to raise wages anymore. There's no labor shortage for us. And the first thing you learn in business school is if you're an employer and you don't have to raise the wages of your workers, don't do it. That's how you make a better business, a better profit. So starting in the 70s, real wages stopped rising. American workers got the same. The stunning statistic that Americans still haven't come to face is, for the last 35 years, the amount of wealth you get for working per hour, the average American worker gets the same bundle of goods and services for an hour's worth of work today that he or she got in 1978. So that changed American economics. It changed our capitalist system. It meant our working class could not assume what they had come to expect: rising wages to pay for a rising standard of living. So their kids could go to school because they could have a nice private home, they could have a car, or maybe two if the wife was working, etc., etc. And the American workers reacted to that in two ways. One, they did much more work. American workers work more hours of paid labor a year than workers in any other country on earth. But the other thing that you asked about is Americans began to borrow. And we borrowed more, than